"Please save me from the rails. I'll be your wife. I'll do whatever you ask," said the Comanche girl. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The Arizona Territory in late summer had a way of stripping the noise out of a man's head. Clint Kane had been riding most of the morning, following the line of the new railroad. His destination wasn't anywhere in particular, just a small trading post he knew had coffee and a farrier who still took payment in hides. At 42, with more years behind him than ahead worth counting, Clint moved through the territory like a man who'd stopped chasing things a long time ago. A former lawman, he'd given up the badge after a gunfight left his wife and boy dead. Since then, his work had been simple: odd jobs, fence mending, a little stock work, keeping himself away from trouble whenever possible. But trouble didn't always return the favor. From the rocky rise, he saw it before he even understood what he was looking at. 30 yards down, the railroad tracks cut straight through the prairie. On the sun-warped rails lay a woman, barefoot, her arms and legs pulled tight with coarse hemp rope, her head turned slightly toward the sky, as if she was waiting for something. Her dress, a traditional Comanche deerskin, was torn at the neckline and frayed along the hem. Dust streaked her skin and hair, and her wrists were rubbed raw where she'd tried to pull free. Clint felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this sort of cruelty before, men using isolation as a shield to do whatever they pleased. The heat, the distance from law, and the company they kept made them braver than they had a right to be. Near the woman, 3 men lounged beside a campfire. From their boots and the cut of their shirts, he pegged them as railroad workers, likely part of the crew pushing track westward. A whiskey bottle moved from hand to hand. Their rifles leaned against a pile of stacked timber like tools they'd forgotten to put away. One of them was idly tossing stones toward the bound woman, grinning when they landed close enough to make her flinch. Clint stayed still in the saddle, watching. He felt the weight of the decision pressing in, the knowledge that if he stepped in, there'd be no walking it back. 3 armed men, likely drunk, and a woman caught in the middle. He could ride on, pretend he hadn't seen it. That would be the smart thing to do. It was what a man with no stake in the fight might do. But that part of him, the part that used to answer a badge, wouldn't let it go. He thought of the times he'd seen someone look away and how many lives had ended because of it. He swung a leg over and slid down from the saddle, leaving the reins loose so the horse would stay where it was. The revolver on his hip felt heavier than usual, his hand resting on the worn grip more for readiness than comfort. He moved down the slope slow and steady, boots placing each step with care, using the scattered scrub for cover. The men didn't notice him at first. They were talking loud, their words slurred, their focus fixed on their entertainment. By the time one of them spotted movement, Clint was close enough for his voice to carry. "That's far enough," Clint said, his tone flat. They turned. One reached toward his rifle. Clint brought up his Colt, the barrel steady, his thumb resting lightly on the hammer. "Leave it where it is," he said. The 2 sitting stayed put. The one standing froze halfway to his weapon, eyes flicking between the gun in Clint's hand and the quiet certainty in his face. Clint kept his gaze on them as he moved toward the woman. Kneeling beside her, he pulled his knife from its sheath. The rope was dry, the fibers stiff from heat and strain. It took only 3 quick cuts to free her ankles and wrists. She rolled off the rail, gravel scraping her arms. Clint gripped her shoulder to keep her upright. He could feel the tension in her, her muscles taut, ready to move but uncertain where to go. That was when the sound came. A distant train horn, the low rumble of wheels on track. It built fast, the vibration reaching through the ground into his knees. "Up," he said quietly. He guided her toward the shallow ditch beside the tracks, keeping himself between her and the 3 men. They dropped into the dry weeds just as the first car roared past. The air shook with the force of it, iron wheels screaming, grit whipping against their faces. When the last car was gone, the silence left behind felt heavier than the noise. Clint stood and offered her his hand. She took it, her grip small but firm despite the raw skin around her wrists. Her voice came steady low. "Please save me from them. I'll be your wife. I'll do whatever you want." There was no pleading in her tone, only the plain truth of someone with no other options. Clint didn't answer. He lifted her into the saddle, mounted behind her, and turned the horse toward open ground. The men shouted something after them, but the words fell away in the wind. The ride from the tracks to Clint's place took over an hour, the sun still high enough to glare off every patch of bare earth. He kept the horse at a steady lope, mindful of the woman's balance in the saddle. She sat rigid in front of him, her hands resting lightly on the horn, not looking back once. He could feel how tense she was, the way her shoulders stayed locked and her breathing stayed shallow. But she didn't tremble, not even when they passed a scattering of mesquite trees that might have hidden someone waiting. He figured she was 24, maybe 25, strong in build but thin from not eating enough for too long. The marks on her wrists and ankles weren't from just that day. They were older, darkened in spots, which meant she'd been tied before. The torn deerskin dress looked like it had been stepped on, the fringe and beadwork broken in places. He didn't ask questions now. There would be time later, and pushing her too soon might just close her up for good. The question of who she was and how she'd ended up there was already forming in his mind, but the answer could wait until they were somewhere the air didn't smell of railroad smoke and stale whiskey. For now, the priority was getting her off open ground. When his homestead came into view, a small weathered cabin, one lean-to shed, a corral with 2 horses and a mule, it looked almost out of place against the endless flat around it. The place was quiet. No visitors, no neighbors for miles. That was why he'd chosen it years back. He swung down first, then helped her dismount. Her bare feet hit the dirt, and he saw her flinch from the heat, shifting her weight. Without a word, he went to the shed and came back with a pair of old moccasins left by a trader months ago. He handed them over. She hesitated, then slipped them on. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the last stew he'd made 2 nights before. A table, 2 chairs, a small bed against the far wall, and an iron stove took up most of the space. He pointed toward the bed. "You can have that. I'll sleep by the fire." She didn't argue, but her eyes stayed on him as if weighing whether to believe the offer. He set a tin cup on the table, filled it from the water jug, and slid it toward her. She drank fast, then slower when she realized there was no rush. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with what hadn't been said. He broke it first. "Name?" She hesitated. "Taya." It was the first real piece of her he had, and he gave his in return. "Clint." He didn't press her about the men on the tracks or where she'd come from, but he knew others would wonder. Had she escaped from a work camp? Was she being hunted? Did she have family nearby? The way she'd looked at him after he cut her free said she didn't expect to go back anywhere she'd been. He set a pot on the stove, tipping in beans, a strip of salt pork, and the last of the onion. While it cooked, she sat at the edge of the bed, watching him. Her eyes didn't wander the room like someone curious. They stayed on him, tracking every move, as if still deciding if he was dangerous. When the food was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls. She ate in silence, spoons scraping the tin. Only after she'd finished did she seem to relax enough to let her shoulders drop. He saw her glance toward the door twice, checking it was still shut. The night came quick. Clint unrolled a blanket near the fire and left her the bed, before snuffing the lamp. He spoke once more, not looking at her. "No one's going to come through that door unless I let him. You can sleep." She didn't answer, but when he lay back, he heard the faint creak of the bed as she settled in. He stayed awake a long while, listening for any sound outside, running through the possibilities in his mind. Whether those men from the tracks would come after her, whether she had enemies elsewhere, whether she'd even want to stay. For now, she was here, and that was enough. But he knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. Clint was awake before the first light came over the flats. Years of habit made it easy. His mind was clear, his movements quiet. The fire had burned low in the stove, leaving the cabin cool. He got up, fed in 2 small splits of wood, and set the coffee pot on the heat. Behind him, he heard the bed creak. Taya was sitting up, her hair loose over her shoulders, eyes following him but not speaking yet. "Water's in the jug," he said, nodding toward the table. She rose slowly, moccasins making no sound on the floor, and poured herself a cup. He noticed how she cradled it in both hands, as if she wanted the warmth. He had work to do. The north fence had been leaning since the last windstorm. He put on his hat and buckled his gun belt, then looked at her. "I'll be inside of the house," he said. "If anyone rides up, you stay inside. Keep the door barred." She gave a short nod, but he could see the question in her eyes. Would those men come back? He didn't say it out loud, but he was thinking the same thing. Out by the fence, he worked the post-hole digger into the dry ground, replacing one rotten post at a time. The sound of each shovel bite carried in the still air. Every so often, he'd glance toward the cabin and see her at the doorway, watching him. He guessed she was weighing whether to trust him more than she already had. By midday, he came back for water. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of boiled cornmeal. She'd found the pot and made a small batch without asking. He sat down, ate a few spoonfuls. "You know how to cook on that stove?" he asked. She gave the smallest shrug. "My mother, she taught me." Her voice was low, careful, but it was the first time she'd offered a piece of herself without being asked. He took that as a step forward. "You got family left?" he asked. Her eyes held his for a moment, then shifted away. "No one." That was all she said, but the way she said it, flat, final, told him not to push. He noticed the way she moved around the room, memorizing where things were kept, the spare lamp oil under the bed, the tin of coffee in the cupboard, the rifle hanging on the wall. She wasn't just looking, she was learning the layout like someone who might need to defend herself. Later, he brought in the shirt and trousers he'd meant to patch. She surprised him by taking them without a word, threading a needle, and working the seam. Her stitches were neat and tight, quicker than his ever were. When she handed them back, he nodded. "Good work." It wasn't much, but it made her glance at him with the faintest trace of satisfaction. As the day stretched toward evening, Clint kept thinking about something from the first night, the way she'd flinched when the wind rattled the cabin's loose shutter. It told him she'd been in places where noises meant danger. If the men from the tracks knew where he lived, they could come after dark, maybe when he wasn't ready. He decided he'd keep his rifle close at night until he was sure she was safe. That evening, they ate together at the table. No talk, just the sound of the stove and the scrape of tin spoons. When the last light faded, Clint checked the door twice, made sure the latch was set firm. She noticed. "You think they'll come?" she asked. "Don't know," he answered honestly. "But if they do, they'll regret it." Her expression didn't change much, but her shoulders eased just enough for him to notice. He banked the fire low and stretched out on the blanket by the stove again, his Colt close at hand. She lay back in the bed, eyes open for a long while before sleep found her. For now, there were no riders in the distance, no sound beyond the soft night wind. But Clint knew that peace in the territory was something you only had until someone decided to take it away. The next 2 days passed quiet, but quiet in the territory never lasted without a cost. Clint had kept an eye on the horizon every morning and evening, scanning for dust trails. On the third afternoon, just as the sun started its slow drop, the kind of movement he'd been expecting appeared. 3 riders coming from the east. Even at a distance, he recognized the slouch and loose seat of men who'd been drinking. Taya was by the corral, tossing handfuls of hay to the mule. Clint stepped out onto the porch, his rifle already in hand. Inside, he told her. She froze, eyes tracking the riders, then went straight to the cabin without a word. The door closed, and he heard the bar drop into place. The 3 horses slowed as they reached his fence. The men didn't bother dismounting at first, just sat there, staring like they were sizing him up. Clint kept his stance easy, but with a rifle low and ready. "You got something that belongs to us," the one in front called. His face was ruddy from sun and liquor, the kind of man who thought volume could make up for reason. "Don't think so," Clint said. His voice stayed calm, carrying across the yard without a shout. "She was with us," the man insisted. "We want her back. That's the law." Clint took a slow step forward. "You tie a woman to rails, you lose your say in the matter." One of the others laughed, short and mean. "She's an Indian. Don't make her yours just cause you cut her loose." The front rider swung down, boots hitting the dirt. He had a revolver on his hip, hand hanging just close enough to make a point. Clint shifted the rifle, barrel lifting half an inch. "You reach for it, you won't finish the draw," Clint said flatly. That brought a pause. The man's jaw worked, but his hand stayed where it was. Behind him, the second rider muttered something about not wanting trouble. The third, tall, narrow-faced, just spat into the dirt and stared at the cabin door. Inside, Taya stood just behind the window, watching. She could see Clint's posture, the way he didn't flinch under their eyes. She felt the heat rise in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a sharp need to stand in the open instead of hiding. Without thinking, she unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch. The movement drew all eyes. She was still wearing the mended deerskin dress, her hair brushed but unbound. She stood straight, voice carrying in the still air. "I'm not yours," she said, looking directly at the front rider. For a moment, no one spoke. The tall one sneered. "You'll change your mind when the law comes." Clint's voice cut in. "Law's a long ride from here, and you're looking at it for now. I'm telling you plain, leave." The lead man's eyes shifted between them, calculating. Finally, he swung back onto his horse. "You'll regret it," he said, but there wasn't much strength in it now. They turned, riding off slow enough to let their words hang, but fast enough to be gone before the light failed. Clint watched until the dust swallowed them, then lowered the rifle. Taya was still on the porch, hands at her sides. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "They might try again, but next time, I'll be ready before they're in sight." She nodded once. "So will I." It wasn't defiance in her voice. It was a statement of fact, and Clint knew she meant it. That night, he kept the rifle closer to the bedroll, and she kept the bar set on the door even after he turned in. Both of them knew the matter wasn't finished, but now it was clear they'd face it side by side. The morning after the confrontation, Clint was outside before the sun broke the horizon, checking the ground for any fresh sign of horses. The yard held only his own tracks, but he didn't trust the quiet. Trouble didn't always announce itself in hoof prints. It had a way of slipping in when a man let himself believe it was gone. Taya stepped out onto the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him circle the corral, leaning on the post when he came back. "They'll come again?" she asked. "Could be," Clint said. "Could be they'll wait for a better chance." She didn't look away from him. "What will you do?" "Same as yesterday, only faster." That seemed to settle it for now. She went inside, and when Clint followed, the smell of something cooking surprised him. She'd found the flour and lard, making flatbread on the stove's iron plate. He realized it was the first time he'd smelled bread in the place since his wife's passing years ago. She slid a piece onto a tin plate and set it in front of him without a word. They ate quietly, but Clint was thinking ahead. If those men returned with more riders, the cabin alone wouldn't be enough cover. He decided to make small changes, nothing obvious, but enough to tilt things in their favor. He spent the rest of the morning repairing the shutter so it wouldn't rattle in the wind, setting up a spare water barrel closer to the door, and clearing a line of sight to the east in case he needed to fire from the porch. Taya didn't just watch this time. She followed him into the shed, sorting through nails, handing him the hammer without being asked, even pulling a coil of rope from the rafters when he needed it. Her movements were deliberate, like she was learning more than just where things were. She was learning how to live here. By midday, they worked side by side, mending a section of the corral fence. Clint caught himself watching how she handled the tools, noting the quickness in her grip, the way she checked the post's steadiness after each strike. It wasn't the work of someone used to being idle. When they stopped to rest, he asked the thing that had been in the back of his mind since the day on the tracks. "Why were you with them?" Her eyes stayed on the fence line. "They took me from the camp where I was staying. Said they'd trade me for supplies in another town. I believed them at first. I shouldn't have. Camp," he pressed gently. "Some of my mother's people. Not my whole family, what's left of it. We were moving north, but they left me." She didn't explain why, and he didn't push. The tone in her voice made it clear she'd already said more than she'd planned. As the sun lowered, they both kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting riders. None came, but the unease was still there. That evening, while Clint sharpened his knife at the table, Taya sat sewing by lamplight, repairing another tear in her dress. The room was quiet except for the scrape of steel on stone and the soft pull of thread. When she finished, she folded the garment neatly and set it aside. "You keep fixing that dress," Clint said. "You'll run out of cloth." She gave the smallest hint of a smile. I'll make it last. It's all I have." He thought about that for a long moment, then stood and pulled a folded wool blanket from the shelf. "This will do until we can get more," he said, setting on the table. She touched it, testing the weight of it in her hands. They slept that night with the same unspoken agreement as before. He by the fire with his rifle close, she behind the bar door of the bedroom. But the difference now was clear. She wasn't hiding from the fight anymore. She was ready to meet it with him if it came. The next morning, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far off. Clint was tightening the cinch on his saddle when he noticed Taya standing by the corner of the cabin, scanning the open land. She wasn't just looking, she was studying the distance the way a person did when they expected movement. "You see anything?" he asked. She shook her head, but her eyes stayed on the horizon. "No, just don't like not knowing where they are." Clint understood. The uncertainty worked on a person's nerves more than the fight itself. "We'll make a trip to town today," he said. "Need flour, shot, maybe some cloth for you. And I want folks to see you here with me. Harder for them to claim you belong to anyone else if half the town's seen otherwise." Taya hesitated, then gave a slow nod. He could tell she was thinking about what stepping into town meant. Exposing herself to strangers, some of whom might know the men from the tracks. They rode out mid-morning. The road was hard-packed from weeks without rain, the sound of their horses carrying in the still air. As they approached the cluster of buildings that passed for the nearest town, Clint felt the shift in her posture. She straightened the saddle, eyes forward, jaw set. At the general store, Clint tied the horses and handed her down. They stepped inside, the air cooler but thick with the smell of wood oil and dried goods. The storekeeper, a thin man with a bent posture, looked up from the counter. His eyes lingered on Taya for a fraction longer than they should have. "Morning, Kane," he said. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," Clint replied, setting a list on the counter. "Need flour, coffee, lead shot, and a few yards of cloth." The man fetched the items, but Clint saw him glance at Taya again, this time with something closer to curiosity than suspicion. She didn't lower her gaze. Instead, she looked right back at him, calm and steady, until he busied himself with weighing the flour. On the way out, Clint carried the sack and box, letting her walk ahead. He watched the way she moved through the street, not hurried, not timid. A few people turned to look, but no one spoke. That in itself was a small victory. Back at the homestead, Taya helped him unload the supplies. She set the cloth aside without comment, but he noticed her running her fingers over it once before folding it neatly. Over supper, Clint finally asked the question that had been in his head since she'd told him about her mother's people. "When they left you, was it because of those men?" She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Partly. They didn't want to fight, they couldn't win. And some didn't want me there anymore. My father wasn't Comanche. They said I brought trouble." Clint felt a slow tightening in his chest. He knew what it was to be cast aside by your own. "That trouble's mine now," he said quietly. "They come back, they'll answer to me." Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time since they met, he saw something settle there. Not just gratitude, but a kind of trust that couldn't be forced. Later that night, when the wind picked up and rattled the loose edge of the shed roof, Clint rose to check it. When he came back in, Taya had placed his rifle on the table within easy reach. She didn't say anything, and neither did he, but both of them knew exactly why she'd done it. The following day broke with a thin, cold light and a wind sharp enough to cut through the seams of Clint's coat. He'd planned to mend the windmill before it got worse. Its tail had been catching in the gusts, making the blade spin unevenly, but the job wasn't one a man could put off without risking his water supply. Taya was sorting the new cloth on the table when he stepped back inside to get his wrench. "You need help?" she asked. "Not for this," he said. "Wind's too strong up there. I'll be quick." She didn't argue, but her eyes followed him as he went back out. The windmill stood at the far edge of the yard, its ladder worn smooth from years of climbing. Clint checked the bolts, then started up. The metal frame swayed with the gusts, each step colder than the last. He was 3 rungs from the top when the wrench slipped from his glove, clanging off the lower braces before hitting the ground. He cursed under his breath and leaned to grab the spare tied to his belt. That shift in weight was all it took. The old wood beneath his boot cracked. and the rung gave way. He fell the last 8 feet, landing hard on his left side. The impact knocked the air out of him, and a sharp pain tore through his shoulder. He lay still for a moment, teeth clenched, waiting for the wave of heat and dizziness to pass. Taya was already running toward him, the bottom of her dress catching on the dry grass. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Can you move?" "Not well," he said through gritted teeth. She helped him sit, her hands firm but careful. When he tried to stand, the shoulder screamed, and his knees buckled. She half-guided, half-pulled him back toward the cabin. Once inside, she cleared the table with one sweep and made him sit. "Dislocated," she said after a quick look. "Needs to go back in." Clint raised an eyebrow. "You done that before?" "Twice. My uncle. You trust me?" He hesitated only a second. "Do it." She had him sit sideways, braced his arm against her hip, and with one smooth motion pushed and rolled. The joint slid back with a dull pop that made his stomach turn. He let out a sharp breath, but the pain eased almost immediately. She tied his arm in a makeshift sling using a strip from the new cloth. "You don't lift anything for a while," she said, her voice firm. For the rest of the day, she took over the chores without hesitation, feeding the stock, hauling water, even carrying the firewood inside. Clint hated being idle, but he watched the way she moved through each task with purpose, like she'd always been here. By evening, he couldn't ignore the question that had been there since the fall. "Why'd you run toward me out there? You could have just gone for help." She gave a small shrug. "Because you're the only one here. If something happens to you, I'm alone again." Her words were plain, without sentiment, but they carried a weight he understood. For both of them, the other had become the only line between living and being left behind. That night, Clint kept the rifle within reach as usual, but for the first time since she'd come, he didn't hear the sound of her door bar sliding into place. Instead, her door stayed unlatched, and the cabin felt smaller, warmer, even with the wind still battering the walls. The morning after Clint's fall came with a heavy, low sky that threatened rain, but gave none. His shoulder ached with every movement, but he decided they couldn't wait any longer to make things official in town. The talk at the fence line would eventually reach the wrong ears, and if those men came back with some half-baked claim, he wanted no one to doubt where Taya stood. She didn't ask why when he told her to saddle both horses, but her eyes narrowed slightly in thought. He could see she understood this was more than a supply trip. The ride was slow. Clint kept his injured arm still, letting the reins hang in his good hand. Taya rode just ahead, scanning the horizon as if she expected trouble to rise out of the grass. The closer they got to town, the straighter her back became. The county office was a squat wooden building on the far side of the main street. The deputy inside, a broad man with thinning hair, looked up from a ledger when they entered. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and Clint saw the man decide, without saying it, that this wasn't the kind of business he'd interfere with. "We're here for a marriage license," Clint said plainly. The deputy didn't blink. "Names?" Taya spoke hers clearly, spelling it out so there'd be no mistake. Clint gave his own. The deputy filled the paper, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. "You sure about this?" the deputy asked, not looking up. "Yeah," Clint said, "and I want it noted we both came in, stood here, and agreed." The deputy nodded once, tore the paper from the pad, and reached for a small box of brass rings on the counter. Clint picked a simple one, paid cash, then turned to Taya. She was holding the carved mesquite ring she'd been working on in the evenings, the one he'd seen her shaping by lamplight. He slid the brass ring onto her finger. She placed the mesquite one on his. No speeches, no crowd, just a look between them that said what neither had put into words before. When they stepped back onto the street, the cold air bit at their faces, but neither of them moved to hurry. They walked past the general store, past the saloon, and though a few people looked their way, no one spoke. That was enough. The ride home felt different. The silence between them wasn't the guarded kind from before. It was settled, like they'd each put their weight on the same side of the scale and found it steady. Back at the cabin, Clint stabled the horses while Taya lit the stove. When he came inside, the smell of coffee filled the room. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him, leaning back just slightly in the chair. "So," she said, her tone even but her eyes sharp, "now it's harder for them to take me." "Harder," Clint agreed. "Not impossible, but harder's a start." They drank in silence for a moment, the kind where both knew there was more to say, but also knew it didn't have to be said right away. That night, Clint left the rifle leaning by the wall instead of at arm's reach, and Taya didn't close her bedroom door at all. The air in the cabin felt different, still quiet, but no longer heavy with uncertainty. It wasn't the end of the trouble, Clint knew, but for the first time since the day on the tracks, he felt like they were standing on the same ground for good. Spring came in slow, the kind where each morning felt just a little warmer than the last. The ground softened, new shoots pushing up through the hard dirt along the south wall of the cabin. Clint had been keeping his eyes on the fence line more out of habit than worry. Weeks had passed without a sign of the three men from the tracks. Whether they decided the fight wasn't worth it or had found trouble elsewhere, he didn't care. The important thing was they were gone. Taya had started planting beans and a small row of greens in the patch of soil Clint had turned for her. She worked in the early hours, the hem of her dress brushing the dirt, moccasins leaving light prints in the tilled rows. Clint watched her from the porch one morning, his coffee cooling in his hand. She moved with the same quiet focus she had when she mended a torn seam or prepared food. Steady, sure, with no wasted effort. Inside the cabin, the changes were small but clear. A second water barrel stood by the door. The shelf had been organized into a system only she seemed to know, but Clint found he didn't mind. The rifle was still close to the table, but it wasn't a constant shadow anymore. The place felt lived in, not just occupied. One afternoon, while repairing the corral gate together, Clint finally said what had been building in him since the day in the county office. "You could have left," he said, not looking up from the hinge he was tightening. "I didn't want to," she replied simply. He nodded, testing the gate's swing. "Not because of the paper, because you wanted to." "That's right." He turned to meet her eyes. There was no hesitation in them now. No guarded edge, no measuring of what he might do next. It was the same steady look she'd had the day she stepped out on the porch to face those men, only warmer. That night, after supper, Clint said the Comanche words she'd taught him. One for water, one for fire, one for bread, one for sky, and then added the last one she'd given him just the day before home. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that stayed in her eyes long after it left her mouth. When they turned in, she didn't go to the separate room. She stayed by the fire with him, both of them sitting in the low light, saying little. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in a slow wave. The next morning, they saddled the horses together, not because they had to go anywhere urgent, but because the work was easier with two. Clint talked about adding another trough, maybe building a smokehouse before next winter. Taya agreed, already thinking about what could be planted if they cleared more ground. By midday, the fence line was checked, the stock watered, and the cabin door left open to the mild air. For the first time in a long while, there was no feeling of waiting for the next blow to fall. They had what they needed and what they'd chosen, and in the territory, that was more than most folks ever got. The trouble was behind them, the ground was steady under their feet, and the life ahead was theirs to keep.